Hello, I'm Steve Page, Director of EPA's Office of Air Quality, Planning and Standards. Welcome to the Air Pollution Distance Learning Network. We're glad that you joined us for today's broadcast. Today's broadcast describes the changes that EPA has made to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ground-level ozone. These standards are designed to protect public health and welfare. In this broadcast, you'll hear from a few of the senior managers and technical experts in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards who helped revise these standards. After evaluating the results of more than 1,700 new scientific studies available for this review, EPA concluded that the 1997 ozone standards needed to be tightened. This new evidence identified important new health endpoints associated with ozone exposure, including school absenteeism, cardiac-related effects, and increased asthma medication use. Furthermore, studies of asthmatics indicated that they experienced larger and more serious responses to ozone than responses for healthy individuals. In addition, new scientific evidence confirms that repeated exposure to ozone damages sensitive vegetation in trees. In response to this convincing evidence, EPA revised the 8-hour primary ozone standard to a level of 0.075 parts per million. The previous standard set in 1997 was 0.08 parts per million. EPA also strengthened the secondary 8-hour ozone standard to the level of 0.075 parts per million, making it identical to the revised primary standard. In coordination with strengthening the nation's ozone standards, we also updated the Air Quality Index to reflect the new primary standard. The Air Quality Index is EPA's color-coded tool used by many state and local authorities to inform the public about daily air pollution levels in their communities. I hope you enjoy the broadcast. There will be an opportunity for you to have your questions answered about the revised ozone standards in the last segment of the program. Now, I'll turn things over to today's moderator, Jenny Noonan.
Thank you, Steve. Let me begin by telling you a little more about who you will see in today's broadcast. We will begin with Lydia Wegman, Director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division, who will describe the health effects associated with exposure to ground-level ozone and details about the 2008 revisions to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone, including the primary standard, the secondary standard, and changes to the Air Quality Index. Our second speaker is Kimber Scavo, Group Leader, State and Local Programs Group. Kimber will give us background information about how EPA intends to implement the 2008 standards. Our final speaker is Lou Weinstock. Lou is the Acting Group Leader of the Ambient Air Monitoring Group. He will discuss ozone monitoring requirements, in particular, how EPA will address the monitoring for the 2008 ozone standards. After the presentations, we will have a short break and return to conclude today's broadcast with a live panel to answer your questions about the new standards. We invite you to begin emailing, faxing, or calling your questions throughout the broadcast using the information provided on the screen. Telephone operators will be available to take your questions. Here's a website you can visit to download slides from today's broadcast. Our goal today is to help you understand our efforts to reduce ozone pollution and to better protect public health and the environment. Now let's hear some specifics about the new standard. Lydia?
Thanks, Jenny. Looking at ozone, let's start with the Clean Air Act, which requires EPA to set primary and secondary standards for common air pollutants. We currently have standards for 6 pollutants: ground-level ozone, also called smog, which we'll be talking about today, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, lead, and sulfur dioxide. And we're actually working right now on a 7th, which is a secondary standard for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide together. The law requires us to review the scientific information and the standards for each of these pollutants every 5 years, and to review, as part of that review, revise the standard if appropriate. We're also required to get advice from our Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, or CASAC, which is an independent scientific advisory committee that is established by the Clean Air Act. In setting ambient air quality standards, there are one set of considerations which are different from the considerations that go into the implementation of those standards. In setting the standards, we look only at the health and environmental effects as revealed to us by the review of science conducted by our Office of Research and Development. When it comes time to implementing or achieving the standards, that's where cost and technical feasibility and the time needed to attain comes into consideration. We last revised our ozone standards in 1997. When we revised the primary standard to protect public health, we consider the health of sensitive populations, including people with asthma, children, and older adults. And we set the standard back in 1997 at 0.8 parts per million, 8-hour average. The secondary standard, which is set to protect public welfare and the environment, and including sensitive vegetation and ecosystems, was set identical to the primary standard, again, 0.08 parts per million at an 8-hour average. But both standards were effectively 0.084 parts per million because of the rounding conventions which apply. Looking now at the new standards, which we set last month, the new standards for ozone are significantly stronger than the 1997 standards. They are, in fact, the tightest 8-hour standards that EPA has ever set. And they reflect new scientific evidence about ozone and its effects on both public health and the environment. For the primary and secondary standard, which are, again, we set to be identical to one another, the standard is set at 0.075 parts per million. This time, however, we specified the level of the standards to the nearest thousandth of a part per million, often called the third decimal place. And this eliminates the need for rounding when comparing the measured ambient levels that we get at our monitors to the new standard. Ozone has many health effects, and what happens with ozone is it penetrates deeply into the lungs, making it more difficult for people working or playing outside to breathe normally and to breathe as deeply and vigorously as they normally would. Ozone can irritate the airways. It can cause coughing, sore, scratchy throat, pain on taking a deep breath, and shortness of breath. For people with asthma, who are much more sensitive to ozone in many instances than healthy people, it can increase asthma attacks and also the use of asthma medication. It can have more subtle effects as well, inflaming and damaging the lining of the lung and injuring the cells that line the air spaces in the lung. And that kind of inflammation can ultimately increase one's susceptibility to respiratory infections and can also aggravate chronic lung diseases like asthma, but also emphysema and bronchitis. If one is repeatedly exposed to ozone and has ozone-induced inflammation, it's possible that permanent changes can occur in the lung, and that can lead to long-term health effects and a lower quality of life, including, as I said, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections and potentially some kind of lung disease such as emphysema or bronchitis. And ozone may continue to cause lung damage even when the symptoms have disappeared because of the inflammation that is caused by ozone. Among the sensitive groups, those groups which are more sensitive to ozone than others include all asthmatics, but particularly asthmatic children and older people who have some other form of lung disease, children in general whose lungs are still developing and therefore they are more sensitive to air pollutants of all kinds, and older adults generally, people who are active outdoors like hikers, and then outdoor workers such as construction workers. Well, since the last review, since 1997, we have a great many more health studies, approximately 1,700 or more new scientific studies. And the studies show that there are adverse respiratory responses at a level of the 1997 standard and below that level. The clinical studies, and by clinical studies I mean studies in which human beings are put into chambers and the effects of ozone on their lungs are studied as a result of their exposure to ozone in those chambers. Those clinical studies provide the clearest and most compelling evidence of an array of health effects. And these include adverse respiratory responses in healthy adults at a level of 0.080 parts per million. These health effects are what we call lung function decrements, which means that you're not able to use your lungs as fully as you normally would, and respiratory symptoms like the coughing and scratchy throat, which I mentioned earlier. In addition, we find that there are what we call biomarkers of lung injury. That means something going on biologically that indicates some damage to the lung. And these include inflammation, increased airway permeability, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infection, as well as increased airway responsiveness, also known as airway hyperreactivity, which means that you just respond more sharply and, as I said, wind up coughing or may feel some discomfort when you try to breathe deeply. So we see these at a level of 0.080 parts per million in the clinical studies. What that tells us is that the current standard, which is effectively 0.084, is not, in fact, protecting people adequately from the effects of ozone. In addition to the clinical studies at 0.080, we also have very limited evidence of lung function and respiratory symptom responses, again, in healthy adults at a level of 0.060 parts per million. We've got 2 studies showing that, but we did consider that very limited evidence for purposes of this review. In addition, we have other studies, which are called epidemiological studies or population-based studies, including multiple city studies that strengthen our confidence in the links between exposure to ozone and these respiratory health effects. Again, lung function decrements, respiratory symptoms, as well as emergency department visits and hospitalizations are found in these epidemiological studies. And the effects were evaluated in some of the more sensitive populations, including outdoor workers, athletes, the elderly, hikers, school children, and asthmatics. We also have new evidence about ozone and mortality. We have large multi-city studies and what are meta-analyses or studies of studies that show a robust association between ozone and mortality. And the effects that we see in these studies are supported by animal toxicological studies, providing information about possible mechanisms of action and biological plausibility for these mortality effects. And in general, the effects are reported at levels well below the level of the 1997 standard. There are other studies that link ozone exposure to health effects that are new in this review, including increased use of asthma medication, school absenteeism, and cardiac-related effects. What we also have found in this review is that asthmatics have a stronger response to ozone than healthy individuals. So studies of people with asthma, and especially children, show that they experience larger and more serious health effects that last longer than responses in healthy individuals. What that tells us is that studies of healthy subjects likely underestimate the ozone-related effects on asthmatics and other sensitive groups, including, as I said earlier, children and older adults. So it's important to recognize that if we're seeing health effects in healthy individuals at a level of 0.080 parts per million, asthmatics are likely to experience those effects at a lower level. This is what we call our pyramid of effects. And again, you can see on the left side the list of people who are considered susceptible and vulnerable to ozone, more so than healthy individuals. What the pyramid shows is that at the lowest level, the lung function, decrements, and inflammation and permeability, you see a larger proportion of the population affected. As you move up the pyramid, you also move up to more severe effects, and you have a smaller portion of the population affected, with death being at the top of the pyramid. But we move up from the lung function decrements to respiratory symptoms and medication use, doctor's visits, school absences, hospital admissions, and emergency department visits. And all of these effects are associated with ozone, with different proportions of the population affected. Turning now to ozone in the environment, which we consider when we're looking at our secondary standards, which are designed to protect public welfare, we find that ground-level ozone is absorbed by the leaves of plants. And through that absorption, ozone can interfere with the ability of sensitive plants to produce and store food, leading in turn to reduced plant growth, reduced biomass production, and/or reduced yields in those sensitive plants. It can also make sensitive plants more susceptible to some diseases, as well as insects, tough weather, other pollutants, and competition with other species within an ecosystem. And in that way, it can reduce or change the diversity of plant species, which can lead to long-term damage to ecosystems that are dependent on those species. If some species are weakened and ultimately die out, that can overall diminish the diversity of the ecosystem and potentially damage its ability to provide whatever function it does in the environment. And there's also the possibility of visible injury to the leaves of the plants. And that affects the appearance of vegetation in national parks, recreation areas, and cities where people often go to relax and enjoy being outside. The current ambient concentrations of ozone in many areas of the U.S., including areas meeting the 1997 standard, have been shown in studies to be sufficient to cause adverse impacts to sensitive vegetation. And since 1997, we have many new studies providing new information about the effects of ozone on plants, but we still have significant uncertainties remaining concerning the extent of the damage, how many species are damaged, and precisely at what levels the damage occurs. So that although EPA does agree with our Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee that cumulative seasonal exposures, that is exposure over, say, a 3-month or 4-month ozone season, is the most biologically relevant for a plant, because a plant is exposed to ozone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as opposed to people. There are so many remaining uncertainties about the best way to protect vegetation. The administrator decided that the wisest thing to do at this time was to leave the secondary standard identical to the primary standard at 0.075. We had considered changing the standard to a different form, the cumulative seasonal form, but in the end, the administrator elected to make those standards identical. As part of our standard review pursuant to Executive Order 12866, we conducted a regulatory impact analysis. As I mentioned earlier, we don't take costs into consideration in setting or revising the standards because that is barred by the Clean Air Act. But we do a regulatory impact analysis, or RIA, looking at the costs and benefits of reducing the pollution to meet different standard levels pursuant to this executive order and guidance issued by the Office of Management and Budget. The RIA for ozone and for all of our national ambient air quality standards is an illustrative analysis, and it provides information about sample control strategies, air quality impacts, and public health improvements that could be achieved using the illustrative and controls that are included in the analysis. But again, the emphasis here is on illustrative. And states will have, and localities and tribes will all have the opportunity to choose the control paths that are most appropriate for their areas. And again, we do not use the benefit and cost analysis in selecting the ozone standards. It is provided for informational purposes only. So looking at the results of the RIA that was conducted for this review, we find that meeting the new standard of 0.075 parts per million will prevent in 2020 a large number of health effects, 380 cases of chronic bronchitis, 890 non-fatal heart attacks, 1,900 hospital and emergency room visits, 1,000 cases of acute bronchitis, over 11,000 cases of upper and lower respiratory symptoms, 6,000 plus cases of aggravated asthma, 243,000 days of missed work or school, and 750,000 days when people have to restrict their activities. What our analysis shows is that using an aggressive control strategy, it's likely that benefits would be greater than costs. But I will note that there are many variations here on both benefits and costs. So we focused on comparing the benefits and the costs here, but doing a net benefit cost analysis is a little more difficult, but the RIA does include those results. So focusing just on the benefits, we found there was a range from a low of $2 billion to a high of $19 billion benefits in the year 2020. And that range is based largely on the fact of mortality and whether or not you assume that mortality is associated with ozone and the extent to which you assume mortality is associated with PM, because there will be particulate matter benefits from controls to reduce ozone through controls on nitrogen oxides. We also estimate that the cost of implementing the standards would be in a range, but a narrower range, from $7.6 billion to a high of $8.5 billion in 2020. Turning now to the expected implementation timeline, the final rule was signed on March 12, 2008. States have to make their recommendations to us as to whether areas should be designated attainment, non-attainment, or unclassifiable no later than March 12, 2009, or within 1 year from the date of signature. Then we at EPA have to complete the final designations no later than 2 years from the date of signature, or no later than March 12, 2010. The Clean Air Act does allow EPA an extra year if there is insufficient information for purposes of designations, but at this time we do anticipate completing those designations no later than March 12th of 2010. Then state implementation plans and the demonstration of attainment would be due 3 years later, sometime in 2013, and then attainment dates would vary somewhere between 2013 and out to 2030, depending on the severity of the non-attainment problem, and only extreme areas would get as long as 2030 to attain. Continuing now with the discussion of implementation, as I said, within a year of a standard being revised, states are required to submit their recommendations to us, and we are required to issue final designations within 2 to 3 years after the standard is revised. At the moment, we are reviewing our existing designations guidance, which was used for the 1997 ozone standard, and we will let the states and tribes know if additional guidance is needed in the very near future. As far as the 1997 standards, for now, those standards and all the associated regulatory requirements remain in place, and so states should continue implementing their plans for the 1997 standards. To the extent there are any transition issues associated with moving from the 1997 standard to the 2008 standard, EPA will cover that in a rulemaking, and we do intend to put a proposed implementation rule out sometime this fall. In addition to implementation, there are monitoring considerations that will be appropriate to keep in mind as we move forward to implement the new 2008 standard. And we plan to issue a monitoring rule with a proposal coming out this June and a final rule in approximately March of 2009. Among the issues we want to consider in that monitoring rule are what requirements should apply in urban areas, including whether we should now require ozone monitors in smaller metropolitan statistical areas, which is to say cities, of between 50 and 350,000 population. Those areas are not currently required to have monitors, and so we want to consider whether it would be appropriate to require monitors in those areas. In addition, we want to consider whether we should have more monitors in rural areas to address the large spatial gaps that exist in the current monitoring network, and whether we should require a minimum number of rural monitors per state. As I noted, we've tightened both the primary and secondary standard, and so it may well be appropriate to have more monitors in rural areas to see what's going on as far as the new secondary standard. The third issue, the third issue, but among other issues that will be considered in this monitoring rule, is the length of the ozone monitoring season, and whether the season should be lengthened in some areas to capture measurements that should be considered in calculating the revised NAAQS, and also the air quality index, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I will note that the ozone season does seem to be lengthening in some cities, and some cities have been monitoring on a voluntary basis and are finding ozone exceedances occurring outside their traditional ozone seasons. I want to note that we've been making a lot of progress toward clean air, and that's been going on as we have learned more and more about ozone and the fact that these effects on human health and the environment are occurring at lower levels. The kind of progress we've been making is that ground level ozone has declined 9% nationwide between 1990 and 2006. And since we first did the designations, for the 1997 standard, we find that 89 of the original 126 areas designated non-attainment now meet the 1997 standard based on 2004 to 2006 monitoring data. And then we have a lot of rules that are already in the books, including the Clean Air Interstate Rule, our Clean Diesel rules, and the very recently issued Locomotive and Marine Rule, which will all help to continue progress by reducing nitrogen oxide emissions. Looking now at some maps to see a comparison between the 1997 standard and the 2008 standard, based on 2004 to 2006 data, you can see that there are 85 counties that are violating the 1997 ozone standard at 0.08 parts per million. Turning now to the next map and looking at the new 2008 standard of 0.075 parts per million, this map, also based on data from 2004 to 2006, shows that there are 345 monitored counties that violate that new standard. Now, looking out at a projection to 2020 and seeing how many counties would violate the 2008 0.075 ppm standard, we see that there are only 28 monitored counties remaining that we project would violate that standard in 2020. And that is based on a wide assortment of rules that are noted in the footnote, including the Clean Air Interstate Rule and our heavy-duty diesel rules, the Clean Air Visibility rules, and also rules that would be put in place to meet our 2006 particulate matter standard, rules that would be put in place by states and tribes to meet that standard. Now I want to talk for a moment about the revised Ozone Air Quality Index. We have changed the index to reflect the new primary standard. We proposed to change it when we put out the ozone proposal, and we have now issued final changes as part of the final ozone rule. We've adjusted the 100 level, which is the upper end of the moderate category, to be equal to the new 0.075 ppm standard. And we have made proportional changes to the other AQI values. We would encourage states to begin using the new AQI breakpoints for their air quality forecasting by the beginning of this ozone season, which is already underway in some places and is coming up very soon in others. Now for a comparison of the old and the new AQI index. What we show here are the number of days that would be greater than moderate for the USA Today cities, based again on 2004 to 2006 data. And what you see are the red bars show the number of days that would be greater than moderate based on the 0.084 parts per million standard, the 1997 standard. And in blue, you see the number of days that would be greater than moderate for the 2008 standard, the 0.075 ppm standard. And what we find is that the increase in the number of days for the new standard is largely due to the increase in days that would be unhealthy for sensitive groups. If you're interested in more information about our new ozone standard, we've got two websites listed here. The first one has a lot of information about the new standard itself, and that website is www.epa.gov/ground level ozone, all one word. And if you're interested in more information about the new air quality index values, you can go to www.epa.gov/airnow/ozone/AQI_memo.pdf.
Thank you, Lydia.